before we dive into tonight's narrative. And I assure you, this one is truly different from anything we've covered. I need to highlight something important. In the description below this video, as well as pinned right at the top of the comments section, you'll come across a link, something we've assembled called the Appalachian Dossier. It's a gathering of reports that were quietly expunged from official U.S. records between 1843 and 1891. Cases that were officially logged, documented, and then deliberately caused to vanish. We've invested months of work into this. Be sure to check it out when you're finished here. The link is available, description and pinned comment. Now, let's turn to the events that unfolded in the Ozark Islands during the winter of 1823. There are certain tales that linger in your mind, not because they are dramatic or seize you by the throat, but because they are hushed in a way that feels fundamentally off. Because the silence woven into them seems too intentional, too deliberate, as if someone carefully went through and extracted every element that could provide clarity, leaving only the outline of something dreadful behind. This is exactly that kind of story. I've been carrying it with me for a good while. The first occasion I pored over the original survey files, I set them aside roughly 20 minutes in and stepped outdoors. I simply stood in the yard for a period. I want you to appreciate that fact, because it's not something I typically do. I have gone through hundreds of similar accounts. I've examined dispatches from wartime, reports from mining camps, and frontier coroner records reaching back to the 1700s. I've sat in rooms surrounded by material that should have unsettled me and walked away unaffected. But something about how the Hargrove Territorial Survey concluded compelled me to seek fresh air, and I suspect that by the time I've finished relating what occurred, you'll grasp why. Before you get comfortable, and you'll definitely want to be comfortable for this one, let me ask you something. Have you ever found yourself in a place so silent that the quiet itself began to feel unsettling? Not peaceful, not still, but wrong. Drop your answer in the comments. I'm interested in where people have encountered that sensation. And while you ponder that, allow me to transport you back, all the way to the autumn of 1822, when a man named Aldous Hargrove was given a commission by the Interior Land Survey Office in Washington and started assembling what would become one of the biggest civilian mapping endeavors ever undertaken within the American interior. Aldous Hargrove was 51 years old at the start of this narrative. He was a surveyor both by profession and by nature, someone who grasped the terrain the way others understand melody, almost instinctively, as a force moving through him rather than a subject he studied. He stood of average height, but seemed heavier than his frame suggested, possessed forearms like coiled rope, and had a beard that had turned white far too soon. His hands were those of someone who had spent 3 decades dragging chains across uneven ground. Knobby at the joints, calloused across the palms, and perpetually stained despite recent washing. He had been born in western Pennsylvania and spent his adult life shifting steadily southward and westward, chasing available work. He had charted parts of the Ohio River Basin, areas of eastern Tennessee, and a considerable section of the Kentucky Highlands. He carried a reputation for precision and stubbornness in nearly equal portions. His wife, Cornelia, had passed away from a fever in 1818. No close relatives could be found. By most assessments, he wasn't a warm individual, but he was meticulous. And in 1822, thoroughness was exactly what the Interior Land Survey Office required. The commission appeared simple, at least on paper. The Ozark Plateau, that wide elevated region covering modern-day southern Missouri, northern Arkansas, and the northeastern corner of what would become Oklahoma, was largely unrecorded in any trustworthy way. There existed Spanish maps, French trading routes, and accounts from the few Anglo-American settlers starting to push into the area, but no organized survey, no precise elevation measurements, no comprehensive catalog of the cave networks, river paths, or geological features that made the Ozarks one of the continent's most intricate internal landscapes. The commission authorized Hargrove to recruit and equip a surveying group of up to 100 men. He enlisted 96. Including Hargrove himself, that made 97 total. He split them into 6 operational teams, each with its own leader, gear, and designated territory to cover. The teams would function semi-independently, spreading out across the highlands and meeting at predetermined points every 3 weeks to share data, resupply, and rest. It was a well-planned initiative. It had adequate funding. It had skilled oversight. It had everything necessary for success, and on March 14, 1823, Aldous Hargrove guided all 97 men into the Ozark Highlands. Not a single one emerged. Now, I want to pause briefly here, because I'm aware of what you're likely thinking. In 1823, expeditions frequently met with disaster. Men perished on the frontier constantly, from sickness, mishap, hostility, weather. The interior was genuinely perilous for Anglo-American survey crews during that time. Any number of circumstances could have claimed 97 lives and left no survivors. That's not the troubling part. The troubling part lies in what was discovered, along with when and where. The survey office waited. 3 weeks passed. No communication. 6 weeks, still nothing. By mid-1823, a rescue team was assembled and dispatched into the highlands to locate whatever remained of the Hargrove expedition. They came upon the camps, every single one. Each base camp that the 6 teams had set up was still intact. Equipment remained in place. Supplies, in certain cases, were still stored. Personal belongings, boots, logs, tools, were neatly organized. The camps showed no signs of assault. They hadn't been abandoned in haste. As far as anyone could tell, they had simply been vacated, as if the men had stepped away briefly and intended to return. The search party uncovered no bodies, no evidence of struggle, no indication of widespread illness, no footprints suggesting a large group heading in any particular direction. In the spring of 1823, 97 men entered the Ozark Highlands, and based on what was left behind, they had simply ceased to exist there. The search team submitted a report. The Interior Land Survey Office acknowledged it. Then, as far as the official record was concerned, the issue was closed. 97 men vanished. No investigation, no subsequent expedition, no public statement. The commission records were stored in the archive basement of the survey office and, as far as anyone can determine, were never examined again for 134 years. I'd like to pause here and check in with you. If you've been listening for a while and are still with me, thank you. This channel exists because of you. We've been presenting stories like this for some time now, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good opportunity. Hit that button. And if you're hearing this on another channel, someone has taken it without authorization. Report it to us if you can. We invest significant effort into this material, and it counts. All right, back to 1957, because that's when everything shifts. The winter of 1957 was widely considered severe in southern Missouri. Unusually heavy rainfall in October had soaked the limestone shelf underlying most of the Ozark Plateau. When the initial hard freeze struck in late November, the ground shifted in ways not seen in living memory. Sinkholes appeared. This isn't unusual in karst terrain. The Ozarks rest on a base of porous, cavern-filled limestone that has been gradually dissolving for millions of years, and the landscape often rearranges itself with little warning. But the sinkhole that opened on the morning of November 19 on a property in Dent County, Missouri, was not quite like the rest. It was sizable, about 30 feet across at the surface, narrowing as it descended. And at its base, visible from the edge if you lay flat and peered down, sat the unmistakable dark oval of a cave opening. The man who found it was named Cormac Stroud. He was 44 years old in November 1957, a veterinarian raised in the county who had returned after the war to take over his father's practice. He was lean and deliberate, as men who work alone for extended periods often are. Not unfriendly, but sparing with words and actions, as if he'd realized early that most things could be expressed with less than people assumed. He had a habit of walking the boundary of his property in the early mornings before appointments, a practice he developed in the Pacific and maintained after coming home. On one of these walks, in the gray light just before 7 a.m., he rounded a cluster of oak trees and found the sinkhole where level ground had been the previous evening. He stood at the rim for a few minutes, tossed a stone in, listened to it fall, then went inside, made himself coffee, and drove to the county seat to report it. The man he informed was a county land surveyor named Prentice Ogilvy, who had an office in the courthouse and, as it happened, was among the few people in Dent County who had ever come across the Hargrove expedition. Not because he'd sought it out, but because years earlier, a history professor from the university at Columbia had published a small pamphlet about lost survey expeditions in the interior, and Ogilvy had found a copy at a second-hand shop and read it during a slow afternoon. The Hargrove expedition had been mentioned briefly, without detail. The professor had noted that 97 men had vanished in the Ozark Highlands in 1823, that no explanation had ever been established, and that the original survey records were presumably still in some federal archive. Ogilvy had thought about it for a day or two, then forgotten it, until Cormac Stroud sat across from his desk on the morning of November 19, 1957, and described a cave entrance at the base of a sinkhole on his property in the eastern part of the county. Property that, as Ogilvy would confirm within the hour by consulting his topographic maps, fell within the boundaries assigned to Survey Team 4 in the original Hargrove Commission documents. Now, I want to be precise here, because what I'm about to relay draws from multiple sources. Ogilvy kept a personal journal, which survived and was later donated to the State Historical Society. Stroud gave a recorded interview in 1961 to a freelance journalist researching an article that ultimately went unpublished. The county sheriff's department filed 2 incident reports that are part of the public record. And there is one other document. I'll come to that. But I want you to understand that this isn't speculation. The events I'm describing were observed and recorded by several independent individuals. They simply weren't brought together in one place until quite recently. Ogilvy drove out to Stroud's property that same afternoon with a flashlight, 100 feet of rope, and a lantern. He parked at the edge of Stroud's driveway, walked across the field with Stroud beside him, and stood at the edge of the sinkhole. In his journal, he noted it was already 4 p.m., and the light was fading. The sky above the oaks was the shade of aged pewter. He described the sinkhole as perfectly circular at the surface, which struck him as unusual, and observed that the walls were smooth, not jagged as a typical collapse would appear, but polished, as if the opening had been shaped rather than formed. He described lowering himself on the rope, while Stroud held it from above. The descent measured about 22 feet. At the bottom, the cave entrance was roughly 5 feet tall and 4 feet wide. He wrote that he paused in front of it before entering. He didn't explain why, but he wrote that he stopped there. What Ogilvy found inside during the first 15 minutes of exploration was unremarkable. A low passage, water, carved over immense time, running horizontally into the limestone shelf. The floor was dry, The walls were tight. In places, the ceiling dropped low enough that he had to crawl on hands and knees. He wasn't a small man, and he wrote that this was uncomfortable. He estimated he crawled about 40 feet. Then the passage opened. He used the word chamber. He wrote, "The passage opened into a chamber of considerable size." He estimated the ceiling at 30 feet above the floor at the center. He estimated the chamber at perhaps 60 feet across, roughly oval. He noted the floor was flat, unusually so for a natural formation, and that the walls showed water erosion at their base, suggesting the chamber had been fully submerged at some distant point. He described formations along the far wall, stalactites, flowstone, the slow mineral architecture that takes millennia to develop. He recorded all of this precisely and calmly in his journal. Then he described what sat in the center of the chamber. Objects arranged in rows, 97 of them. Each one was a leather satchel of the kind used by survey parties in the early 1800s for carrying instruments, documents, and personal correspondence. Each was closed and buckled. Each rested on the flat stone floor, spaced about 3 feet apart in every direction. They were arranged in rows of 7, with 2 rows of 8 at the far end. They weren't scattered or piled. They weren't disordered. They were placed deliberately, with obvious care. Ogilvy wrote that his initial thought was someone had been there before him and arranged the satchels as a joke or performance. His second thought, arriving almost immediately, was that the cave entrance had been sealed by the sinkhole collapse from above, meaning whatever was in that chamber had been there since before the sinkhole appeared, since before November 19, 1957, possibly for a very long time before that. He didn't open any of the satchels that night. He climbed back up the rope, told Stroud what he'd found, then drove back to town, sat in his office until midnight, and filled 12 pages of his journal. The final line of that entry reads, "I have been a surveyor for 22 years. I know what survey satchels from the early period look like. The ones in that cave are old. I don't know how old. I know they are old. Have you ever uncovered something you weren't meant to find? Not taken, not hidden by you, just something that was there, waiting, that had no business being there? Drop that in the comments. I'd like to know." The following week, by Ogilvy's account, was the most disorienting of his professional life. He returned to the cave twice more before telling anyone in an official capacity. On the second visit, he brought a better lantern and measuring tape. He confirmed the count, 97 satchels. He confirmed the arrangement, rows of 7 with the remainder at the back. He confirmed, by examining a small number without opening them, that the construction matched survey equipment from the early to mid-1800s. On the third visit, he brought Stroud. He wrote that Stroud stood in the chamber's center for a very long time without speaking. Then Stroud said, "Those have been down here a long time." Ogilvy said, "Yes." And Stroud asked, "Who put them there?" Ogilvy said he didn't have an answer. On December 8, 1957, Ogilvy contacted the State Historical Society in Jefferson City and reported the discovery. He didn't mention the Hargrove expedition by name in his initial report. He described it as a cave find containing what looked like 19th century survey gear. A representative from the society arrived 4 days later. Her name was Dorothea Castle. She was a historian and archivist, 60 years old, who had spent most of her career cataloging records from Missouri's settlement and territorial periods. She had never heard of the Hargrove expedition before Ogilvy mentioned it. Within 20 minutes of standing in that chamber with her own lantern, she was fairly certain she had. When Castle and Ogilvy finally opened the satchels, carefully, with Stroud watching from near the entrance, they turned out to be more than equipment cases. Each contained survey instruments, as expected. Compasses, chain segments, worn-down pencils, paper folded into precise squares. But each also held a personal journal. Not a survey log, but a personal journal. 97 journals written by 97 men. I want to pause here, because this is the part I find almost impossible to sit with. Think about what that means. In the early spring of 1823, 97 people sat in a cave somewhere in the Ozark Highlands and wrote in their journals. All of them. At roughly the same time, presumably. Then those journals were placed back in their satchels, and the satchels were set in rows on the chamber floor and left there for 134 years. The men didn't leave with the journals. The men were never found. Only the journals remained, arranged, waiting. Castle and Ogilvy read the journals over several days, working methodically, cross-referencing dates and names. They could identify most of the writers. The Survey Commission records, which Castle obtained from the Federal Archive in Washington within 2 weeks, included a full roster of 97 names. 94 of the journals matched names on that roster. 3 remained unidentified. The handwriting in those 3 was distinct from the others, and the names inside their covers matched nothing in the Commission's official records. No one has ever explained that, but I'll return to it. The journals told a story, not a complete one, not one with clear outlines, but a story, and I want to present it to you the way it came through those pages, because I think that's the only honest approach. The expedition started well. The early entries from the first few weeks after the party entered the Highlands in March 1823 are professional, exact, and unremarkable. Elevation data, river crossings, soil notes, weather observations. The kind of entries a trained surveyor would record daily on a long assignment. Occasional personal notes appear. A man named Rufus Coulter, team leader of Survey Team 2, wrote about a recurring dream he'd been having. Lightly, with some humor, calling it the same nonsense again, and making a joke about his tendency to overthink minor troubles. Zebidiah Lorne, transit operator for Team 5, wrote extensively about the spring light in the Ozark Highlands. He had apparently tried painting before surveying, and his descriptions of late afternoon light through the limestone bluffs are, according to Castle's notes, genuinely fine. Another man, a chainman on Team 3, who signed entries only as M. Ashcraft, wrote almost nothing personal for the first 3 weeks. Just data. Clean, dry, impeccable data. Then something shifted. The tone changed across all examined journals around the 3rd week of April. Not simultaneously, but spreading like rumor or changing weather. The earliest sign appears in Rufus Coulter's journal. On April 22, he wrote that his men had encountered a geological feature they couldn't explain. A patch of ground about 40 feet in diameter where the grass had died in a perfect circle. Not burned, not worn down, just dead, gray and flat against the surrounding green meadow. His transit operator measured it and confirmed it was nearly geometrically precise. Coulter himself was pragmatic. He noted unusual geological features were common in karst terrain, and that many explanations existed. But he wrote that his men were uneasy. The next morning, 2 of them asked privately if they could alter course to bypass the area. He refused. He wrote, "I said we are here to map what is, not to avoid it because it is strange." They accepted it, but weren't happy. Over the following 2 weeks, similar entries appear across multiple journals. Not from all teams, but from enough to make the pattern unmistakable in hindsight. A man named Odell Vickers, assigned to Team 4, wrote on April 29 that he had woken up 3 nights in a row around 3 a.m. with the strong, inexplicable conviction that someone was standing just outside his tent. He checked each time. There was nothing. He wrote with genuine puzzlement rather than fear. I do not consider myself a man given to fancies, but the conviction is very strong. I will try to describe it more exactly. It is not a sound. It is not a smell. It is a certainty. The way you feel certain that a fire is behind you even before you turn around. Stroud, reading that passage during the journalist's interview in 1961, said it was the sentence that lingered with him. The way you feel certain that a fire is behind you even before you turn around. He said he read it 3 times and was still thinking about it years later. The entries from early May 1823 are harder to read. Not due to content precisely, but because of the change in the writing itself. Castle noted that the prose in most journals became compressed in the first 2 weeks of May. Shorter sentences, longer gaps between entries, a drop in personal observations that had marked earlier sections. She described it as the writing of men who are measuring their words. Not necessarily frightened, but careful. The way you are when you're not sure who might be reading. On May 9, Team 4 leader Osborne Goodwitter made the first direct reference to the cave. He wrote that his team had found an entrance during a routine survey of a limestone ridge about 14 miles southeast of their base camp. He described it as roughly 6 feet tall and 10 feet wide, partly hidden by cedars. He wrote that the air emerging from it was notably cool and smelled of deep water. When he stood near it, he had the impression, he used that word, that the cave went much further than its exterior suggested. He decided to log it and return with the full team the next day. He wrote that as they moved away toward camp, one of his men, Virgil Chadburn, 38, a surveyor of 14 years, stopped and looked back. Chadburn stood staring at the entrance for almost a full minute, then said, "Someone's been keeping that entrance clear." Goodwitter looked carefully and saw Chadburn was right. The cedars on either side were old and dense, but the ground directly before the entrance was clear. Not recently, but compacted in a way that suggested regular use. Something or someone had been moving in and out consistently for a long time. The entry ends there for May 9. Goodwitter's entry for May 10 is brief. Returned to the cave as planned. Found the entrance sealed. 7 feet of clean fill. We dug for 2 hours. The fill goes deeper than we reached. He didn't return to that cave, but other teams did. Over the following week, entries from teams 1, 3, and 6 all reference cave systems in their areas. Descriptions are similar. Large entrances, cool air, the sense of great depth, and in each case, a detail that shouldn't be there. Team 3 surveyor M. Ashcraft, the one who'd written only dry data for the first month, wrote on May 14 that his team found an entrance and that inside, about 12 feet in, there were marks on the wall. He called them geometric. They didn't match any indigenous mark, making tradition he knew. They appeared to have been made with a metal tool. He sketched them in his journal's margin. Castle tried to identify them in her analysis, but couldn't. She wrote, "They are not letters in any alphabet I can identify. They are not pictographs in any tradition I can place. They are deliberate and regular, and I do not know what they mean." On May 17, Aldous Hargrove's personal journal, found in one of the 3 unmatched satchels, identified by handwriting comparison against his official documents, contains the first entry that can genuinely be called alarming. Hargrove wasn't a man who wrote about feelings. His journal had been almost entirely operational. But on May 17, he wrote 9 lengthy paragraphs. He noted that 3 of his 6 teams had approached him within the same 48-hour period reporting similar experiences. He'd initially considered that the men were influencing each other, that the first report had created a contagion of anxiety, distorting subsequent ones. After questioning each team leader separately and in detail, he no longer believed that. The accounts were too consistent. not in specific details, but in feeling. Every leader described the same thing, not the same sight or sound, but the same sensation. That the landscape was not indifferent to them, that the highlands had taken notice of them, and that whatever had noticed was not afraid. Hargrove wrote, "I am a man who has spent 30 years in difficult country. I know what it feels like to be in terrain that is actively hostile. The kind of cold that wants to kill you. The kind of flood that has no personal interest in whether you survive. This is not that. The highlands are not hostile. They are attentive. There is a distinction and it matters." Then he added, "I have decided that tomorrow we will locate the central cave system." He had triangulated his team leaders' reports and determined that, despite geographic spread, all entrances appeared at roughly the same elevation and geological plane. He believed they weren't separate caves. They were one enormous system beneath the entire survey area, with multiple entrances that had been systematically sealed, one by one, as his men found them. I'll pause here, because I know some of you are listening in the dark. Headphones in, lights off, and I want to ask you something. Does that feeling Hargrove described, attentive, not hostile, does it sit differently than fear? Because it does for me. Hostility you can fight, flee from, defend against. But something simply watching you, waiting to see what you'll do next. That's a different weight. Leave a thought in the comments. I genuinely want to know. On May 18, Hargrove brought all 6 teams together for the first time since the expedition began. He wrote that they camped on a flat limestone shelf at about 400 feet elevation, and he briefed team leaders on his plan for the following morning. He wrote that the men's mood was, his word, taut. Not panicked or mutinous, just taut. They have been good men throughout. They continue to be good men. But there is something in all of them now that was not there in March, and I cannot name it precisely except to say that it is the opposite of ease. As night fell and fires were lit, he walked the camp's perimeter alone. The night was clear and unusually cold for May, the stars exceptionally bright. At one point, standing at the eastern edge looking over the dark limestone shelf, he heard something. Not words, not movement, but something that was aware of me. Something that had been aware of me possibly for a long time. He stood there a while, then returned to the fire and didn't sleep. May 19. This is the last date in most journals. Hargrove's entry is the longest. He wrote it in sections, some in morning light, some in the reduced visibility of a cave interior with lanterns. He wrote that the party departed at first light and moved east toward the location he had identified as the cave system's likely center. He described the walk. Flat limestone cedars, water somewhere below audible through cracks. They arrived at an entrance, not one previously found, a new one, larger than the others, perhaps 15 feet high and 20 feet across. The stone around it was smooth in a way he hadn't encountered in natural formations. He didn't say it was worked, only that it was smooth, and that the smoothness was old, and he couldn't explain it. The air from it was cold, much colder than the surroundings. The kind of cold with depth, not surface chill, but the cold of something extending very far down. Several men stopped and hesitated. He didn't scold them. He stood at the entrance himself. He wrote, "There is something coming from inside that I am trying to find the right word for. It is not a sound. It is not a smell. It is more like a pressure. The kind of pressure that tells you when you walk into a room, whether or not the room is empty. This room is not empty." He entered first, lantern ahead, the men following. His entries continue from inside. The passages opened quickly into a larger system than expected. He described chambers connected by varying passages, formations that impressed him. Flowstone columns from floor to ceiling, a cave wall covered in white crystal in the lantern light. He wrote distances and directions methodically. He noted the party moving deeper. At some point, he realized the passage behind them was no longer visible, and the ambient sounds of the outside world. Wind, distant water, the acoustic presence of open space, had vanished. He wrote, "The silence in here is absolute. I have worked in underground mines and in closed rooms, and I have never heard silence like this. It is not the absence of sound. It is something closer to the presence of something that is absorbing sound, as if the cave is listening." About 2 hours in, by his estimate, the party reached the chamber. He described it in detail. Enormous, ceiling 60 feet or more, roughly circular, diameter about 200 feet by pace count. Floor flat. Walls, by lantern light, covered in marks. The same geometric marks Ashcraft had described, covering every surface, floor to ceiling. Hargrove wrote, "I have spent 20 minutes simply looking at them. I cannot identify a repeating unit that would indicate language as I understand it. I cannot identify a pictographic tradition that I recognize. But I do not believe these marks are decorative. I believe they are functional. I believe they are saying something. I do not know what." He wrote that several men moved around the perimeter examining them. The mood had shifted from taut to quieter, something he struggled to characterize. The men are calm. This is the surprising thing. After weeks of the discomfort I have described, they are calm in here. I am not certain whether that comforts me or frightens me more. Then most journals stop. 94 of them end on May 19, 1823, most mid-sentence, not with conclusion, not with sign-off. Just a pen lifted mid-word in 3 cases, mid-sentence in 11, the rest simply trail off. The last word written, then nothing. 3 journals continue past the 19th. One of the unidentified ones, Hargrove's, and one other. That other belongs to a man identifying himself only as R. Lanark. There's no R. Lanark on the Hargrove roster. No R. Lanark in any surveying records Castle could find for the period. But the journal is real. Physically consistent with the others. Same construction. Ink, leather. And it was in the cave in one of the 3 unmatched satchels. I need to tell you about Lanark's journal. The early portions, March and April, are in a hand Castle, described as educated and careful, entries brief and largely observational, reading at times like a naturalist's notes, plant life, rock formations, weather. But there's a quality setting it apart from other journals. The others are records of men doing a job. Lanark's reads like the journal of a man watching something. Not the landscape, but the expedition. There are oblique, difficult references to events among the survey party, to a change in the air preceding similar observations in other journals by days, to what is being prepared and the patience required, to the men and their particular blindness. Repeated several times, in slightly different phrasing, is a sentence Castle underlined in her notes. They are going exactly where they were always going to go. Castle's analysis runs 42 pages, cautious, heavily qualified. She was a careful scholar and clearly uncomfortable with what the journal suggested. But in her conclusion she wrote, "The Lanark journal, taken in isolation, could be read as the record of a disturbed or delusional individual who attached himself to the survey party for unknown reasons and wrote in ways that imposed retrospective coherence onto his account. Taken in the context of the full archive, the 94 matched journals, the survey records, and the physical evidence of the cave itself, it becomes more difficult to sustain that reading. Lanark appears to have known in advance where the expedition was going, what it would find, and that none would leave. I'll be honest. I've spent a long time wrestling with what to say next, because there are several interpretations possible, and it's not my place to choose for you. I'll share what the journals say and let you sit with it. Hargrove's journal continues past May 19. He wrote 2 more entries. The first, dated the 20th, is short, morning. We are still in the chamber. I do not know why we have not left. There is no disagreement about leaving. There is no inability to move. We simply have not left. When I stand and intend to walk toward the passage we came in by, I find that I do not walk toward it. I find that I sit back down. I do not understand this. I am writing it down because I am a surveyor, and recording what I observe is what I do. He noted the men weren't distressed. This continued to confuse him. They were quiet, sitting or standing, some looking at the marks, some with eyes closed. Vickers was asleep. Coulter wrote in his own journal. Lorne, who loved light, who had painted, stood very still near the chamber's center, hands at his sides, with a look Hargrove couldn't describe. Not blank, not empty, but something he might call peaceful in other circumstances. He wrote, I do not feel peaceful, but I notice that I am not afraid. The second entry, dated the 21st, is Hargrove's last. He wrote, I understand now why the marks are here. Not what they say. I do not understand what they say, but I understand what they are for. They are for people who come here. Someone put them here a very long time ago for exactly this purpose. I think they are kind. I'm putting this journal back in the satchel now. I want whoever finds it to know that we were not afraid. I want them to know that something was here before us. Something that has been here for a long time, and that it is not what we would have expected, and that I am not afraid. Then 3 final words. It was waiting, and that's where the record ends. 97 men, 97 satchels, 97 journals, no bodies, no explanation, no survivors. Just the words of people who went somewhere they couldn't return from, and, by every account they left, were not ultimately afraid. There's a postscript, and it's not comforting. In 1959, Prentice Ogilvie retired as county surveyor. His retirement remarks in the local paper made no mention of the cave. He moved to Springfield and lived there the rest of his life. But he kept his journal, and in its final entry, written 3 weeks before his death in 1974, he wrote something. It was found by his son, who donated it to the Historical Society without reading it first. His son later said he wished he had read it, because it would have prepared him. Ogilvie wrote, I have been thinking about the chamber again. I have been thinking about it most of my life, if I am honest, but lately it has been very close, closer than usual. I went back twice, once in 58 and once in 60. I never wrote about it. I didn't know what to say. The second time I went back, the satchels were gone. The chamber was empty, just the marks on the walls. But there was something new, one new satchel, on the floor in the center where they had all been. One satchel, closed and buckled the way the others had been. I left it there. I don't know who left it. I don't know when. I haven't been able to stop thinking about whether there is something inside it. I hope that whoever is reading this does not go and look. I think that is what it wants. Cormac Stroud, in his recorded interview, was asked if he ever went back to the sinkhole. He said, once, about a year after Ogilvie first found it. The journalist asked what he found. Stroud was quiet a moment, then said, the sinkhole had filled in. Ground looked the same as always, like it was never there. Asked if he'd tried to dig, Stroud said no. Asked why not. Because whatever closed it from the inside didn't want me coming back in. And I had the feeling that it already knew I'd been there once, and it had decided to let that go. But it wasn't going to let it go again. The 3 unidentified journals, Hargrove's, Lanark's, and the third, are held by the Missouri State Historical Society. They're in the archive, theoretically accessible to qualified researchers. But according to the last archivist, who checked the physical files, the third journal, neither Hargrove's nor Lanark's, hasn't been signed out since 1963. When she went to retrieve it for a researcher who requested it, it wasn't in the box. The box was otherwise undisturbed. The catalog listed it as present, but it was gone. It hasn't been found. No one knows when it disappeared, where it went, or who took it. No one has determined what name was written inside its cover. So here we are, at the end of a story that doesn't truly end, because 97 people entered a cave in the Ozark Highlands in spring 1823, and what they found, what found them, and what they wrote in their final hours. None of that has ever been explained. I've been doing this long enough to know the difference between a mystery that wants to be solved and a mystery that wants to be left alone. This one, I think, wants to be left alone. But I also think it knows we can't do that. I think that's part of it. Hargrove wrote, "Eat was waiting." And I keep returning to that, not to the horror, but to the patience. Whatever was in that cave had been waiting a very long time before those 97 men entered. And it waited. Let them come at their own pace. Let them sit and look at the walls, let them write. And they weren't afraid. That last part is what I can't let go. Because I think, in some way I can't fully close off, they weren't afraid because whatever was there wasn't trying to terrify them. It was trying to tell them something. And they understood it in those final hours, wrote it down as best they could, then went, and the journals stayed, as if they knew someone would come looking, as if they left the record on purpose. For us, the Ozark Highlands remain, the limestone shelf remains, the caves remain, most unmapped, some based on geological surveys from the 1980s and 90s, far larger than previously known, a system extending beneath hundreds of square miles of interior highlands, connecting one system with many entrances. And somewhere in an archive in Jefferson City, Missouri, a box holds 2 journals, Aldous Hargrove's and Lanark's, the third missing. And a researcher somewhere is probably applying for access right now. And I think about that researcher, and I think about Ogilvy's last words. I hope that whoever is reading this does not go and look. I think that is what it wants. Whatever you do tonight, whatever you're thinking about as this ends, I want to ask one thing. When you go to sleep and the house grows quiet and the dark settles around you, how certain are you that the quiet is empty? Drop a thought in the comments. Tell me what part of this stayed with you. Tell me if you've ever been somewhere that felt like it was paying attention. And if you know something about the Ozarks. If you've spent time in that terrain, if something happened to you there you haven't been able to explain. I truly want to hear it. That might be our next story. And if this kind of account is what you're here for, stay with us. We have more. They're not easy ones, but they're real. We'll see you next time.